Welcome back. We are continuing now with our lectures on the different types of love stories. This is lecture number 5 of Hamilton's Mythology. And now we turn to story number 4, Pygmalion and Galatea. Now this is a fascinating story, and in fact it's had a life of its own in the 20th century even. Pygmalion is this amazing gifted sculptor. So think of it this way: if Orpheus is the great musician, Pygmalion is the great sculptor, the great artist. But he has a problem. He hates women and he never wants to marry, right? However, he makes this beautiful statue of this beautiful woman, and in the process he falls in love with his creation. The way that Edith Hamilton says it is, such was the wondrous power of this disdainful young man. The supreme achievement of art was his, the art of concealing art. It's an interesting and a wonderful line. Well, he falls in love with this lifeless thing, so much so that ultimately he goes to Venus, Aphrodite, Venus in the Latin story here, and he prays for a woman like his statue. Venus is so moved by Pygmalion's dedication to his art that she in fact allows for the statue to become human, and this is of course Galatea, right? Galatea. And their son, they have a son named Paphos, becomes Venus's favorite city. Now at 2a, there's obviously different messages, themes for this one. One, of course, is this notion of art as being the quest for perfection or love, right? The other major message is obvious. To love the ideal can be sometimes dangerous, right? Because, I mean, he's in love with his own art, and it's not real. At 2b, the symbol obviously is the statue itself, which represents in some ways perfection, but a cold, we might say, perfection until it has become human. We think at 3a of the Pinocchio story and the creation of Geppetto's boy, but is not a real boy. But it's Oscar Wilde's Pygmalion and the play drama movie that followed it called My Fair Lady that plays this game probably the best. A man takes a woman off the street who can speak English but very poorly, and he turns her into this amazing kind of phenom, and she can fool people that she is a famous princess or whatever. In the process, of course, the artist who linguistically recreates this woman falls in love with her. It's a wonderful film, and it's a way to build off of this storyline. Well, at 3b, of course, here to relate this to ourselves, it's an interesting question. Do you think that it's dangerous to love the ideal? Or are you of the opinion that, no, loving the ideal is what one should do, right? It's what drives all ultimate loves, is the love of the ideal. You can decide. Story number 5. This is the Baucis and Philemon story. It's a very interesting little tale, and it kind of takes an interesting twist on this notion of love. We're told at the very beginning of the story that in the Phrygian hill country there is an oak and a linden tree, 2 different kinds of tree, but actually growing together as one tree. And the question has always been, why is this? And the answer is because a long, long time ago, Jupiter and Mercury, Zeus and Hermes, decide to disguise themselves and to walk among a certain group of people as beggars, looking for hospitality. They find none, until ironically they go to the house of an old poor man and woman, and there they find, we are told, they had lived in a cottage all of their married life and had always been happy. Quote, "We are poor folk," she said, "but poverty isn't so bad when you're willing to own up to it, and a contented spirit is a great help too." And as they are met by Jupiter and Mercury, they invite them into their house. They take good care of them as they can. They've got nothing. They offer what they have, that is to say, hospitality to them. But they notice that it's fascinating that the wine bowl, the mixing bowl, never runs out of wine. And at some point, they kind of begin to realize they're in the presence of gods. By the way, this notion of food or drink never running out is a familiar motif in mythologies, the idea that you can keep eating and the food keeps coming back or whatever. Jupiter, that is to say Zeus, then points out, well, we're kind of taking stock of this country and we're unimpressed with the lack of hospitality. You can obviously see the message here, right? And he floods the surrounding area, leaving only Baucis and Philemon and an island, where on this island is a beautiful temple. And Zeus says, because you were so hospitable to me and to Mercury, what is it that you will want? And they say back, well, we kind of want two things, if that's okay. One, we want to be the priests who will take care and guard your temple. And two, let us live and die together. At the end of our story, then, now both of them are granted their wish. Now both were in extreme old age. Suddenly, as they exchanged memories, each saw the other putting forth leaves. Then bark was growing around them. They had time only to cry, "Farewell, dear companion." As the words passed their lips, they became trees, but still they were together. The linden and the oak grew from one trunk. From far and wide, people came to admire the wonder, and always wreaths of flowers hung on the branches in honor of the pious and faithful pair. Well, it's a wonderful story. Let's work now at 2A really quickly. Obviously, one of the major messages here is hospitality. The idea of treating all people with kindness, even people from whom you can gain nothing, right? Because maybe they're poor or whatever, right? At 2B, the symbol, because we're concentrating on symbols here, well, obviously the tree is a powerful symbol. Two souls, right, if you will, that become one over time, right? Two hearts that can become one over time. The mixing bowl is also an interesting symbol. Think about it. The notion that kindness never runs out. No matter how much of it you share, you always get some back in return. Of course, in 3A, we can ask all kinds of questions. You know, many years ago when the film Titanic was very popular, many of my students pointed out that one of the most compelling scenes is right at the end of the film when you know that the boat is going to sink, and how different people deal with it. And one of those scenes is to show an old man and woman, clearly have been lovers for a long time, lying on a bed. Obviously, they know that they are about to drown. But there doesn't seem to be any horror or fear about that fact because they are together. It's a touching scene. It's a scene of all of maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and yet many of my students said it was one of the most compelling single moments in film they had ever seen. I like to think about the great Will Durant and his wife Ariel. And Ariel and Will Durant were famous historians, and they wrote really famous books, and they lived together all their life, but they ended up dying within a matter of days of each other. One could not live without the other. You've probably heard stories of the same. At 3B, obvious question, how about hospitality or kindness? Do you consider yourself hospitable? Do you think it is important to be kind to all people, even to people who maybe are quote-unquote beneath you? Some have pointed out Worland High School would be a much nicer place if we actually took care of each other in this way. All right, let's turn now to story number 6. This is a really interesting little tale. It's a very brief story. Endymion, and Endymion is a famous kind of character, maybe we would say, in mythology. Some will see him as a king, some will see him as a hunter. Most will reference him as just simply a shepherd, but he is a beautiful, beautiful lad. And the moon, Selene, falls in love with him, and we have then the famous moment when in the poetry, I'll read it for you. Endymion, the shepherd, as his flock he guarded, she, the moon Selene, saw him, loved him, sought him, coming down from heaven to the glade of Latmus, kissed him, lay beside him, blessed is his fortune. Endymion is blessed his fortune. Endymion evermore he slumbers, tossing not nor turning. Endymion the shepherd, he never woke to see the shining silver form bending over him. In all the stories about him, he sleeps forever, immortal, but never conscious. It's an interesting idea. The moon loves him, but only in his magic slumber. Well, this is interesting. At 2a, one possible clear message here is beauty can be both a blessing and a curse. We've seen this in several of these stories, haven't we? At 2b, the symbol of the moon, right? A fruitless love, right? A love, but a fruitless love. It is unconscious. At 3a, Keats actually wrote a poem about Endymion, and it's beautiful poetry. I recommend it to you. We think about that text, The Beauty and the Beast, as well, don't we? Because remember, the Beast starts out as this gorgeous young man, and yet because of his poor treatment of a woman who is actually a goddess of a kind or a witch or whatever, he ends up being scarred. In other words, there's this notion of how beauty can be both a blessing and a curse, right? And then finally at 3b, do you think that beauty is in fact a blessing or a curse? Sometimes beautiful people have pointed out that they feel like they're not taken seriously because of their physical beauty. Some, in fact, students that I have taught try to de-emphasize the fact that they are physically beautiful and known to be so because they want to be taken seriously. All right, let's go to story number 7. This is the famous Daphne story. It has already been mentioned for us in earlier lectures, especially those lectures on Persephone, but let's talk about it. Daphne, well, she's the hallmark of the independent, love and marriage-hating young huntress. She becomes Apollo's first love. He sees her and he immediately wants to be with her, but she rejects him. She's like, no, I'm not sleeping with you. If I sleep with a god, I'll die. Her father, Daphne's father, Peneus, is the river god, and he's worried. He's like, you know, I'm never going to have a grandson. You need to find a man and settle down. But she says it, let me be like Diana, Artemis, that virgin warrioress that runs through the woods. She loves to run. She doesn't want to be defined by being married to a man or being with a man, and certainly not a god in Apollo. Apollo chases her. She runs. She can't run away from a god. She falls down on her knees. She holds out her hands and prays for deliverance. Her father will turn her into a laurel tree. And if you travel in Athens and Greece, you will see these trees. And if you kind of stretch your imagination, you can see that it always seems like there's a major part of the tree, and then there's the two arms reaching up to the sky, maybe we would say. Well, one of the obvious messages or themes is that resurrects that question about love versus lust. Notice that Apollo, he doesn't really care about her. He just wants to fulfill his lust by being with her because she is so beautiful. But we should point out that Apollo, because she's turned into a laurel tree, says, this will be my favorite tree, and any time that we are going to celebrate in Greek culture, if we're going to celebrate a victory or whatever, we will do it with a laurel branch. So for example, if you're in the Olympics and you win, you don't get like lots of money or whatever. The recognition that you get is defined by this laurel branch that's around your head. Of course, that means that to be the easy symbol here is the laurel tree, the award to the victor, we might say. At 3a, in relation to other texts, this is a fascinating question. What is the text for you that you like the best where a woman refuses to be tied down to a man? We think, for example, of W.B. Yeats begging the woman he loves to marry him, and she says, no, I don't want to be defined by being married to you. I want to be defined in my own way. What about independent-minded women and whether they should be subdued or not? We immediately think of Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew as a classic example. At 3b, it's a fascinating question about Apollo as player. Why do you think that a player hates a beautiful woman who refuses him? Why is that? Okay. And how about this one for a 3b question? We have a phrase in our culture, don't rest on your laurels, which comes from this story. The idea being that once you have accomplishments, don't just sit back on those accomplishments, but rather keep pursuing, keep pushing yourself. All right, let's go now to story number 8. This is the Alpheus Arethusa story, and it's a fascinating story as well. In Ortygia, which is a part of Syracuse, outside the greatest city of Sicily, Syracuse, a sacred spring there, Arethusa, and the question always has been, well, what is this? What's up with this? Why is it such a beautiful important spring of water. Well, we're told that Arethusa is a beautiful young huntress. Again, we're back to this same storyline again, a follower of Artemis, not interested in men. Alpheus is the god of the river, and he chases after her. He runs her down because she cannot escape. And Arethusa is changed into a spring of water, a sacred spring, which actually connects Greece with Sicily. At 2a, well, this is an interesting message from this one. That idea that you can't always be free. You often get to do the things you want to do, but sometimes you got to do the things that you have to. In other words, you can't fight fate, no matter how hard we run. It's an interesting idea. This question of free will versus determinism is clearly played out here. At 2b, the symbol obviously is the river or the spring, always flowing, which involves evolution, but it does raise that question of determinism versus free will. To what degree are our lives predetermined in some way for us, whether that be biological predetermination or some kind of theological or metaphysical predetermination? To what degree are we free to be able to make our own decisions? At 3a, finally, to finish up this lecture, let's compare all 9 of these stories. And the question, as we resurrected it at the very beginning, of love versus lust, how many of these stories do you see them as not about love, but really about lust, versus how many of these stories are about quintessential love? At 3b, which one of these was your favorite story and why? Which was your favorite symbol and why? Okay, well that ends our lecture now. Let's turn in the next lecture, lecture number 6, to chapter 7, The Quest for the Golden Fleece, and chapter 8, 4 more great adventure stories. We're going to meet this idea now in part 2 for Edith Hamilton, and she's obviously setting us up for the most famous of all of these ideas in the Troy Tale, but the idea that life is kind of like an odyssey. Life is kind of like an adventure. And we'll be reminded, of course, of Longfellow's Psalm of Life. In this world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb-driven cattle, be a hero in the strife. This idea of the hero, we're about to meet it now in our next lecture. Thank you. I hope that you'll come back.